In December 1944, Europe froze in a thick silence, as if the entire continent were holding its breath. In western Germany, the forests of Ardennes were shrouded in heavy fog, the trails slippery, motor vehicles leaving long tracks on the snow. In that sub-zero cold, the German High Command placed its faith in one final gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the counter-offensive that Hitler himself considered the move to turn the tide of war. According to the records of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Germany mobilized 200,000 soldiers, 1,000 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, along with thousands of trucks, anti-aircraft guns, and supply horses. The ultimate goal was to seize Antwerp, split the British-American alliance, and force them to negotiate a separate peace, thus prolonging the life of the Reich. In Berlin, Hitler believed that the Americans were weak-willed and unable to endure heavy losses. General von Rundstedt, who was assigned to command the front, understood that this counter-offensive allowed no room for error. "If we fail, Germany will no longer have any offensive capability," he wrote in the Ardennes Campaign Diary 1944. Columns of panzer vehicles lined the forest roads, lights off, tarps drawn, waiting silently for orders. Above them, the grey, fog-laden sky grounded American reconnaissance aircraft. In that weather, it seemed as though nature itself stood with Berlin. In the American camps at the forward positions, the atmosphere was entirely different. Many units, including the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, had been sent to the Ardennes to rest and recover combat strength. They pitched tents, lit fires, and wrote in their journals that this forest is so quiet it feels suspicious. According to the U.S. Army Intelligence Bulletin, December 1944, most American intelligence officers believed that Germany was exhausted and lacked the fuel for a major campaign. They were wrong. Both divisions were inexperienced. Many soldiers had arrived in Europe less than 2 weeks earlier. On the night of December 15, the fog was so dense that one could feel the moisture clinging to sleeves. Across the lines, German troops assembled in silence. No lights, no talking, no smoking. The engines of the Panthers were started in turns to keep them warm. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Celsius, light snow concealing the tracks of treads. When the clock struck 5:30, the ground shook as if from an earthquake, recalled an American soldier of the 14th Cavalry Group in the after-action report, 1945. During the first 20 minutes, 1,600 artillery shells per minute rained down on the American front line along 85 miles of the battlefield. Communication stations were cut off, radio systems jammed. In the forests around Monschau, bursts of flares flashed and vanished in the rain of shells. The Americans called it the fire curtain, the wall of fire that marked the opening of the largest offensive Germany had launched since Kursk. According to the IX Corps log, the 16th of December 1944, within just 3 hours, the entire line of the 106th Division was fragmented, and more than 8,000 soldiers lost contact. From the German side, the assault unfolded exactly as planned. The tanks of Kampfgruppe Piper, from the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, advanced nearly 60 kilometers in 2 days. Somewhere in the White Forest, the roar of engines and thunder of guns intertwined into a cold metallic rhythm. "Everything happened so fast we couldn't comprehend it," recalled Lieutenant John F. O'Neill of the 99th Division. "I saw men thrown out of their trenches, their bodies spinning amid snow and smoke. For the Germans, it was a moment of resurrection. For the Americans, it was the collapse of faith in industrial superiority. General Hodges of the 1st U.S. Army was forced to order, 'Hold your positions at all costs,' even as artillery ran low on ammunition, communications disintegrated, and air support was grounded by fog. The entire Ardennes battlefield had become a deadly labyrinth where the line between defense and despair blurred. American soldiers scattered in trenches, hands gripping frozen rifles, stared up at the lead-coloured sky. They did not know that in the artillery depots behind them, a weapon never before used on land was sealed away. According to the 406th Artillery Group Ordnance Record, Deck 1944, several thousand special shells marked VT, variable time, were stored in underground bunkers south of Monschau, awaiting declassification orders. At the front, the sound of German guns pulsed like the heartbeat of a metal beast. In Bastogne, reconnaissance units of the 101st Airborne moved through the snow, each step sinking deeper into grey mist. Farther south, American supply convoys were trapped on forest roads buried under thick snow. "It felt like we were fighting in the dark," wrote Corporal James P. Hill in his diary. By the morning of December 17, American platoons began to realize their enemy was not merely shadows moving through the fog. It was a meticulously calculated operation, where every meter of ground was mapped for artillery fire. "The sky was their weapon," said one artillery officer in the US. Field Artillery Journal, 1946. The Germans fully exploited the weather's cover, turning the fog into their ally. But in the American rear lines, engineers and artillery officers knew they held an unplayed card. Inside the lead-sealed ammunition crates lay a technology that would permanently alter tactical maps. It was neither a chemical weapon nor a nuclear bomb. It was the result of years of quiet research in a small laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, supervised by Dr. Merle Tuve and his team. As December 16 drew to a close, the front was still shrouded in smoke. The sun never truly rose over the Ardennes that day. And in the whistling wind through the pine forest, amid the chaos of hundreds of thousands of men, a silent question formed in the minds of many American officers. Could victory still come from conventional artillery, or would they have to unseal the weapon waiting in the deep bunkers? At the edge of the forest, the flash of a 105mm gun flared briefly, then vanished. All that remained was mist and the echo of metal dissolving into the cold wind. In that darkness, history awaited activation. While German artillery was pounding the Ardennes, more than 3,000 kilometers to the west, in an old building in Silver Spring, Maryland, a group of scientists continued their quiet work. The sign outside read, "Used Car Dealership," to mislead passers-by, but inside was a top-secret American research facility where the first smart weapon in human history was taking shape. The project belonged to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and was directed by Dr. Merle Tuve. A physicist from Carnegie who had once studied cosmic rays, he now led a program that the Navy classified as equal in secrecy to the Manhattan Project. According to the U.S. Navy Ordnance Development Report 1945, at its peak, the project mobilized 3% of all American physicists. They came from MIT, Bell Labs, General Electric, and RCA, working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. None of them was allowed to speak about their work, not even to family members. One engineer recalled after the war, "I told my wife I was fixing radios for the Navy, and she believed it for 2 years. Employees signed confidentiality agreements, and even personal letters were inspected. Each finished product carried a unique code, with records stored in Washington for traceability when needed." Inside the building, disguised as a used car dealership, wooden tables were covered with soldering tools, wires, microscopes, and vacuum tubes. Their goal was to create a fuse that could sense its distance from a target and detonate at the ideal altitude. According to Johns Hopkins APL Progress Note No. 4, 3 Deck 1943, they gave it the codename VT, short for Variable Time Fuse. Each fuse consisted of 130 electronic components, including 4 to 5 miniature vacuum tubes, all of which had to withstand an acceleration of 20,000 grams when fired from a gun, temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and remain stable in the cold air at altitudes of several thousand meters. Under normal conditions, a vacuum tube would shatter instantly under such pressure, so Tuve's team had to invent new materials that were both lightweight and elastic. An internal memo dated the 12th of June 1944 stated, "If we fail to solve the problem of mechanical durability, the entire project will collapse." To protect the tubes, they used synthetic rubber cushions and spiral-shaped designs to distribute the shock. Inside, a radar system operating at 180, 220 MHz, continuously emitted signals. When the reflected wave from a target reached sufficient strength, the circuit triggered the shell to explode 30-50 feet above the ground, right in the zone of maximum lethality. This work demanded advances far beyond civilian radio technology. At that time, the transistor had not yet been invented, and everything depended on vacuum tubes. It was Dr. James Van Allen, then only 30 years old, who found a way to shrink a vacuum tube to the size of a pencil tip while keeping it functional. According to the Van Allen papers, Iowa University Archive, 1956, he called it the smallest living tube. This breakthrough made the entire team realize they were opening the door to a new era of miniaturized electronics, the foundation for future computers and satellites. The APL engineers did not work alone. More than 100 American companies joined the supply chain from RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania to Crosley Corporation. The Crosley plant in Ohio stopped refrigerator production to assemble fuses. Sylvania converted its entire light bulb line to defense work. They called the program an industrial miracle. Every component from copper wire and aluminum plates to insulation coatings underwent separate testing and was recorded by batch number. If a fuse failed on the battlefield, it could be traced back to the individual worker who made that solder joint. In early 1942, the cost of producing one fuse was $732, equivalent to more than a year's salary for a skilled technician. But through standardization and mechanization, by late 1944, the price had dropped to $18 per unit, while quality improved. The War Production Board Bulletin No. 2-011944 confirmed that the U.S. reached an average output of 40,000 fuses per day, one every 2 seconds, operating around the clock. The total cost of the entire program exceeded $1 billion, the second largest figure after the Manhattan Project. Quality control was described as uncompromising. Each production batch was randomly sampled for live testing, and any fuse that detonated at the wrong time led to the rejection of the entire lot. An internal report recorded, "A deviation of 0.02 seconds could cost an entire frontline unit their lives." Hundreds of female workers inspected every solder joint under magnifiers, their hands trembling from exhaustion. One of them recalled, "We worked until our fingers blistered, but no one went home, because everyone knew out there someone was waiting for these shells." By the summer of 1944, as production peaked, the U.S. government expanded assembly to 2 additional centers in New Jersey and California, employing over 80,000 workers. Military trains carrying the fuses were disguised as shipments of radio components to evade espionage. Each crate was sealed with a red lead stamp, and only officers of colonel rank or higher were authorized to open it. By the end of the year, over 22 million fuses had been produced, ready for every battlefield. At Silver Spring, Dr. Touvet often returned to his office after midnight, walking down silent corridors, hearing the hum of ventilation fans and the yellow light falling across technical diagrams. A colleague remembered, "He never raised his voice. When a prototype finally worked, he just said quietly, 'It works.'" In that moment, amid war, the silence of the laboratory carried as much weight as the roar of the guns in the Ardennes. The Proximity Fuse project proved that science could change the entire course of war without adding a single new gun. The white-coated scientists in Silver Spring created a weapon that could calculate its own distance, something frontline soldiers had never imagined. When the sealed crates of shells were shipped to Europe in late 1944, none of them knew that just a few weeks later, the fuse would be fired for the first time in the Ardennes forest and mark a turning point in World War II. And at that moment, in the dim corridors of APL, people kept working amid the steady vibration of machines. Someone glanced through the window, saw snow falling outside, and said softly, "If we succeed, someone out there will live because of this." In the faint neon light, figures bent over, soldering circuits no larger than a fingernail. They did not know they were rewriting the rules of war. At dawn on the 16th of December 1944, The small town of Monschau on the German-Belgian border was still shrouded in thick fog. The howling wind through the pine forest was drowned out by waves of rumbling artillery from the east. The ground shook repeatedly, snow fell from the branches, and drifted into trenches not yet reinforced. On the western hill, the American 38th Cavalry Squadron, a thinly equipped mechanized reconnaissance unit, was struggling to hold the defensive line under mounting pressure from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. The Germans attacked in dense formations, using the mountainous terrain to advance unseen. The American gun crews returned fire weakly, their shells hitting the ground and sinking into the muddy snow, leaving round craters but failing to halt the enemy's advance. According to the U.S. 406th Artillery Group report, December 1944, at that time, the area's artillery commander, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, was on duty at a forward command post near Monschau. He was 45 years old, a former mathematics teacher before joining the army, known for his cautious and taciturn manner. However, that morning, everything exceeded calculation. Observation posts reported that numerous German trucks were flooding through the Rhein Valley, with infantry following in clusters. Poor visibility rendered American air power useless, while conventional shells fell off target and were detonated prematurely by trees. Axelson understood that if the Germans captured the high ground, the entire defensive line of the 38th Cavalry would collapse within hours. In the command bunker, he looked down at the map, holding the field phone receiver. A young lieutenant suggested, "Try the VT fuse, the new type of shell not yet authorized for ground use." Axelson remained silent. The order from the General Staff was clear. Under no circumstance will VT fuses be used in ground combat. The reason was the fear that Germany might recover samples and copy the radar technology. This regulation was stamped top secret and transmitted to all artillery units. But now, as the forward outposts reported loss of contact, his only choice was either to violate the order or to watch his men be annihilated. According to the 406th Group Diary, the 16th of December 1944, at 7:45 a.m., Colonel Axelson issued a brief order. "Load VT, fire for effect." That sentence would later be quoted in numerous U.S. Army training materials. The 105mm M2A1 howitzers were loaded, triggers pulled, and in that moment, physics met warfare. As the first shell flew, everyone waited to see what would happen. The explosion did not erupt from the ground, but from the air. At an altitude of about 30 to 50 feet, the shell detonated, scattering thousands of metal fragments in a storm of steel. German soldiers moving through the forest heard the hiss but had no time to take cover. "It exploded above us. There was nowhere to hide," said a corporal from the 326th Division upon capture, quoted in Interrogation Report No. 2, 041945. The second artillery salvo swept across the trail where German squads were massing. This time, the entire area vanished into smoke and screams. American observers recorded results far beyond all expectations. The airburst shells created a lethal zone many times greater than impact detonated rounds. Each 105mm VT shell could cover nearly 30 meters, rendering any attempt to take shelter in holes or behind tree trunks useless. The U.S. Field Artillery Evaluation, January 1945, noted that, for the first time in the war, forest terrain was no longer a shield for infantry. The remaining German troops retreated hastily, abandoning their weapons and wounded. American reconnaissance units radioed, "Enemy halted. Airburst is effective." Axelson said nothing. He sat on an ammunition crate, listening to enemy casualty reports, holding an unlit cigarette. He understood the weight of his act. It was an unauthorized order. If the High Command found out, he could be prosecuted for revealing classified military technology. But he also knew that decision had saved hundreds of men crouching in trenches under German fire. Later, one of his subordinates recalled, when the attack stopped, he just said one sentence, "They'll know it worked," then went silent. News of the VT shell's effectiveness spread rapidly. Within 48 hours, the report from Monschau reached the headquarters of the First Army. According to the SHAEF operational log, the 19th of December 1944, Eisenhower read the encrypted message at 9:15 and immediately ordered verification. After 2 days of analysis, on the 21st of December 1944, the Supreme Command officially lifted the restriction, authorizing the use of the fuse across the entire Ardennes front. This decision, recorded in U.S. War Department Bulletin number 351944, marked the first time in history that radar technology was used directly to control ground fire. From the moment Axelson gave the order to fire, the course of the Ardennes battle began to change. The artillery that had once been merely a supporting arm now became the decisive weapon. According to calculations by the Ordnance Corps, the average kill ratio of American artillery increased 5-fold in subsequent battles. But the true significance of that action did not lie in numbers, it lay in the fact that one officer dared to choose between regulation and human life. After the war, in an interview with the Army Historical Division, 1946, Axelson simply said, "I did what I had to do. War doesn't wait for permission." He was never prosecuted. In fact, he was promoted a year later. Many later scholars regarded his decision as a symbol of moral initiative, the ethical autonomy within warfare. At Monschau, snow still fell thick at noon that day. The artillerymen cleaned their gun barrels, cigarette smoke mingling with the cold air. No one spoke much. Only the sound of cooling metal drifted in the wind. Far away, the pine forest still smouldered, flames reflecting on the white snow like thousands of tiny stars. And at the heart of that battlefield, in the quiet that followed, a technology had stepped out of the laboratory's shadow to become the weapon that would decide the war. As night fell, Axelson looked out from the bunker and saw the sky glowing with distant streaks of artillery fire. He wrote a short line in his diary. "VT authorized for ground use. It begins." Those words were later preserved in the U.S. National Archives, Record Group 338. And from that moment on, American artillery entered a new era where the boundary between science and the battlefield was erased by a single, solitary decision amid the snowy woods of Monschau. When news of Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson's decision reached the southern fronts, supply convoys began transporting the new ammunition crates marked with the VT symbol toward the Ardennes. Each red-sealed case was opened under the supervision of artillery officers. No one knew much about the mechanism, only that they will explode at the exact moment. According to the 1st Army Ordnance Log, the 20th of December 1944, the first units to receive the fuse rounds were the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, and the 420th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 3 forces positioned along the defensive lines surrounding Bastogne. In the final days of December, Bastogne was completely encircled. German forces of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and Panzer Lehr tightened their grip around the small town. Snow fell so heavily that transport trucks could not move, and the 75mm pack howitzers of the 463rd had to be dragged by hand up icy slopes. Captain William Mackay, an artillery officer, wrote in his diary, "Every time we pulled a gun into position, my body felt like it was coming apart, but we couldn't retreat because behind us was the town." On December 19, when the Germans launched their first assault, VT shells were loaded. According to the 463rd Battalion record, Dec 1944, during the 12-day siege, they fired 7,676 rounds, a large portion of them equipped with radar fuses. When the shell left the barrel, it made a strange, sharp sound. The N above, at an altitude of about 40 feet, it exploded, forming a blinding white halo. One gunner recalled, "We couldn't see the target. We only saw the whole forest light up, then go silent." The effect was beyond expectation. German units that had relied on dense formation tactics, advancing across snowy fields, were wiped out in minutes. According to the after-action report, 101st Airborne Division, Jan 1945. Each airburst shell covered an area 5 times larger than a conventional shell, making it impossible for the enemy to regroup. The Germans, once accustomed to hiding in shell craters, were now killed even while lying still. One prisoner later testified, "We didn't know whether to stay underground or run. Death came from above." A few kilometers from Bastogne, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, the only African-American unit in the area, also joined the fight. They operated 155mm M1 guns, positioned to guard the outer ring of the town. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, 1983, they formed a circle of death around Bastogne, where every assault was crushed by airburst artillery. When a barrage struck the fields to the west, a German officer wrote in his report that the ground seemed to flip over. Many German soldiers lost morale, abandoning vehicles and weapons. From besiegers, they gradually became scattered groups, retreating in chaos. On the 25th of December 1944, in the Sauer River Valley, a German battalion attempted to cross the thin ice at night. They believed the cold and fog would conceal them. But on the western bank, American artillery crews were ready. According to General George S. Patton's memoir, War as I Knew It, 1947, "We caught them in the middle of the river. The new potent ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air then. They had nowhere to run." When the shelling stopped, American soldiers counted 702 bodies, the entire German battalion wiped out in just a few minutes. That was the first time the airburst tactic had proven its absolute effectiveness. Every traditional concept of artillery trajectory, firing angle, impact point was overturned. A single gun could now control an area many times wider, and accuracy no longer depended on the observer's line of sight. The U.S. Army Tactical Analysis Division, 1945, concluded that the VT fuse transformed artillery from a supporting tool into an active weapon of destruction. As the Bastogne encirclement tightened, ammunition began to run low, but each VT shell was worth 10 times that of an ordinary one. American gunners used them sparingly, firing only when enemy concentrations were large. A line in the 463rd logbook read, "We counted to 5 before pulling the lanyard, and when the smoke cleared, everything was silent." Later, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Sherburne said, "Without the fuse, Bastogne would have fallen in 3 days. With it, we held for 12. During prisoner interrogations, many Germans described a new kind of fear. The air exploded, they said, and even the sky felt like it was hunting us. Some units began calling the shells Glock des Todes, meaning Bell of Death. The name spread quickly from Bastogne to the Our River region. German soldiers passed around rumors that the Americans possessed a weapon that could hear human breathing. It was a shift from tactical fear to psychological panic, something no army had ever experienced before. Inside Bastogne, soldiers of the 101st Airborne shared rations of chocolate and strong coffee. The distant rumble of artillery came at steady intervals, like a clock. One soldier joked, "Their Christmas bells are a little loud." But outside the perimeter, it was truly the sound of annihilation. According to Patton's 3rd Army communication record, the 26th of December 1944, German forces began a phased retreat, and the Bastogne encirclement was officially broken on December 27. When the fog lifted on December 28, the battlefield around Bastogne was covered with corpses and blackened circular craters. American observers recorded, "The snow was no longer whole, as if the sky had fallen to the ground." In that silence, American gunners realized they were holding a weapon that no longer belonged to the old era. The Silver Spring Laboratory had delivered something that changed the nature of war. While inspecting artillery positions, one officer paused to look up at the grey sky and murmured, "We used to fear the fog. Now the fog fears us." The remark was scribbled in the margin of the Artillery Command's report as evidence of a mental turning point. From Monschau to Bastogne, the battlefield was no longer defined by terrain, but by technology. And in the cold winter of 1944, science spoke in the only language war could understand the silence after the explosion. In mid-December 1944, while the southern front at Bastogne was still engulfed in a storm of artillery, another battle erupted in the northern Ardennes. On the high ground known as Elsenborn Ridge, two American divisions, the 2nd Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division, held the strategic road leading to Liège, the critical logistical gateway for the entire Allied front. If this route fell, the Germans would gain a direct path deep into Belgium, severing the supply lines and opening the road to Antwerp. Facing them was Nazi Germany's most elite force, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, equipped with Panther and Tiger tanks and infantry hardened by years on the Russian front. On the morning of December 17, fog still blanketed the Ardennes forests. According to the U.S. 7 Corps log, the 17th of December 1944, the Germans opened the attack with artillery at 6, followed by tanks and infantry advancing along the eastern slopes of Elsenborn. But unlike in other sectors, here the Americans did not retreat. The steep terrain, hardened snow, and strong winds made mechanized advance difficult. Above them, American artillery units had already prepared firing coordinates covering the entire hillside. When the first Panthers appeared, volleys of 105mm and 155mm shells erupted, and among them, 40,000 rounds equipped with VT fuses were activated. According to the U.S. Army Artillery Operations Summary, Jan 1945, a total of 160,000 shells were fired over 3 days, with Elsenborn accounting for nearly 1/3 of all artillery expenditure on the front. This was the first place where radar fuses were used on a campaign scale. The outcome was not measured in casualties, but in the attackers' complete loss of combat capability. German officers described in the Wehrmacht after-action debrief, Feb 1945, that the SS formations broke apart before they even reached the American lines. They could not see their enemy, only the sky erupting into thousands of simultaneous explosions. Elsenborn Ridge became an impenetrable defense line. Each gun of the 2nd Division had an average of 500 VT shells, fired alternately with conventional rounds to create a double rain effect. At 50 feet above the ground, explosions blanketed the slopes, stripping away any ability to regroup. One American officer described, "We didn't need to see, just hearing the echo feedback on the radio told us the area was clear." Artillery no longer played a supporting role, it commanded the entire rhythm of battle. According to the 2nd Infantry Division Combat Report, the 19th of December 1944, the German counterattacks were disoriented, fragmented, and uncoordinated as communications between platoons were severed. Over the next 2 days, SS units continued their assault, bringing in Tiger II tanks and Stu 3 assault guns, but it was their own logistics that collapsed first. American artillery fire was so dense that every supply convoy was destroyed before reaching the front. Forest roads became graveyards for transport trucks. The German Army Supply Report, Dec 20-194-4, recorded the loss of 72 vehicles and 23 artillery pieces in a single movement. Whenever ambulances appeared, shells burst again from above, rendering rescue efforts hopeless. The Germans began to move at Nig, T, but the radar fuses did not depend on light. Even when tactics changed, the shells still detonated at the exact altitude, saturating the entire area. The effect of the fuse was not only physical but also psychological. A former SS veteran later testified in the U.S. Psychological Warfare Report, 1946. "We couldn't understand how the American guns knew exactly where we were. Every time we looked up, the sky was blazing." The Germans called it Feuer von oben, fire from above. In previous campaigns, the SS had always been dominant in morale, convinced of their invincibility, but at Elsenborn, that faith was crushed by a weapon they could not see. The German High Command tried to respond. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, ordered all long-range artillery to break the Elsenborn defense zone. However, due to weather and ammunition shortages, the order failed. In his battlefield diary, he wrote, "American artillery dominated every movement. Even the veterans lost their discipline." This statement was later quoted in the U.S. Army Historical Division interview 1946, as an admission of the end of SS Panzer superiority. By December 19, after 3 days of assault, the 1st SS Panzer Division suffered around 5,000 casualties, roughly 60% of its total strength in the area, according to Allied Intelligence Estimate No. 2, 7 Jan 1945. More crucially, its command system was completely paralyzed. Communication lines were destroyed, supplies halted, and tanks ran out of fuel. Elsenborn was no longer a battle for terrain. It became a lesson in how artillery could use science to control the battlefield. When the reports reached higher command, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt remarked, "The proximity fuse was decisive." He understood that the Battle of the Ardennes had lost its strategic meaning the moment American artillery gained control of the low sky. Meanwhile, von Manteuffel added, "American artillery broke even the strongest soldier's spirit." These were not compliments to the enemy, but first-hand conclusions about a new kind of warfare. Later, American military analysts viewed Elsenborn as the first demonstration of an active fire control system. The U.S. Field Artillery School Review, 1947, described the battle as the transition from reactive artillery to strategically coordinated artillery, where information, mathematics, and radar fused into a single unified force. At Elsenborn Ridge, the mechanical might of Germany, the symbol of the Blitzkrieg era, was stopped not by opposing tanks, but by thousands of thinking shells. When the battle ended, smoke still drifted over the slopes, the wind carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and burnt pine resin. American soldiers emerged from their dugouts, looking through splintered trees. A sergeant of the 99th Division wrote in his notebook, "We held the line not because of luck, but because someone calculated every meter of this space precisely." In that place, amid snow and smoke, a new tactical era was born, one where the precision of science replaced faith in brute strength. Elsenborn Ridge, more than any other battlefield, proved that those who master data will master war itself. On the morning of the 1st of January 1945, while the ground in the Ardennes still smouldered from artillery fire, the skies over Western Europe witnessed one of Nazi Germany's final desperate gambles. The plan, called Operation Bodenplatte, was a large-scale Luftwaffe air offensive designed to destroy Allied forward airfields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. According to Luftwaffe Command Brief No. 11-Deck 1944. Germany deployed 900 aircraft, including Bf 109, FW 190, Me 410, and several jet-powered Me 262 seconds. Their mission was to strike by surprise on New Year's morning, when Allied air forces would be least alert. In theory, the plan was flawless. The sky was overcast, the fog was thick, and Allied radar performance was reduced. But below, American and British anti-aircraft units had been equipped with the new VT fuse rounds, the same technology that had saved Bastogne and Elsenborn just weeks earlier. According to the 9th Air Force Air Defense Command Report, Jan 1945, orders to deploy radar fuses were issued across the entire front just 2 days before Operation Bodenplatte began. On New Year's Eve, American gunners replaced mechanical fuses with the new, polished radar heads. No one knew that the next morning would be the system's most brutal trial by fire. At 6:15 a.m., the sky over Antwerp lit up as hundreds of German aircraft appeared on radar screens. American pilots were still eating breakfast in their tents when the alarm sounded a few minutes too late, but the anti-aircraft network was ready. From Brussels, Eindhoven, to Liège, thousands of 90mm and 120mm guns tilted upward, loaded with the special VT-marked rounds. When the firing cords were pulled, the entire sky became a labyrinth of fire. According to the U.S. 9th Air Force Statistical Review, 1945, that day 277 German aircraft were shot down, 172 of them 62% by anti-aircraft fire using proximity fuses. This figure exceeded all previous records. The average hit rate of American anti-aircraft artillery increased fivefold compared to shells with contact or timed fuses. At Antwerp, one air defense officer recalled, "We saw shells no longer burst aimlessly, each seemed to choose its own target. The FLAF 192nds caught fire the moment they slipped through the clouds." German pilots later described the experience in the Fliegerkorps memoir, 1946. There was no escape. Shells detonated all around as if space itself had folded in. A survivor from JG-11 said, "I saw blue flashes surrounding the plane and didn't realize they were radar fuses. Within seconds, my friends were gone." The difference lay in the self-detonating mechanism. Each VT warhead emitted radar waves at 180, 220 MHz. When they met a metallic object with an electromagnetic reflection, such as an aircraft fuselage, the system triggered detonation at the optimal distance, eliminating the need for angle adjustment or time calculation. At the command level, the results stunned even the German Air Ministry. The German Air Ministry loss assessment, the 2nd of January 1945, admitted to 277 aircraft destroyed, 65 pilots killed, and over 100 captured, including several senior officers who had taken part in the Normandy campaign. The loss was irreparable. Germany had run out of fuel and lacked trained pilots. A Luftwaffe official wrote in his final report, "We have thrown our last cards into the flames." On the Allied side, reactions mixed astonishment with relief. Air defense radar logs showed the fuse's performance far exceeded expectations. The RAF Technical Summary No. 681945 stated, "Proximity fuses have transformed anti-aircraft defense from probability to certainty." It was no longer random intercept fire, it was the mathematical control of space. With a high rate of fire and precise detonation range, each 90mm gun was now as effective as an entire fighter squadron. In the Brussels command room, Major General C.R. Hübner wrote in his diary, "New Year's Day ended the Luftwaffe." The phrase spread through the US Army as an affirmation that the air war had turned a page. The Bodenplatte operation marked not only the failure of a campaign, but the downfall of the Luftwaffe itself. After that day, Germany would never again muster a large-scale air assault over Western Europe, according to the US War Department evaluation. March 1945. Following the operation, the Luftwaffe's average sortie capacity dropped by over 70%, with fewer than 300 operational aircraft remaining on the entire Western Front. From then on, control of the skies belonged fully to the Allies. American pilots flew without escorts. Bombers attacked in daylight without fear of retaliation. Historians would later call it the silent collapse of the Luftwaffe. In the weeks that followed, the Allies exploited this advantage to support ground offensives. B-26 and P-47 missions took off from airfields that Germany had targeted during Bodenplatte, now operating continuously under the protection of anti-aircraft guns armed with VT fuses. Every time the Germans tried to launch an aircraft, radar picked it up, and the guns rained a metallic storm into the sky. In February 1945, during a meeting in Paris, General Eisenhower was presented with a full report on the proximity fuse's performance during the operation. After reading it, he set his pen down and simply said, "This is precision warfare." The remark became the headline of Army Review Quarterly, 1945. The first official acknowledgement by the US military that the radar fuse was the first precision weapon of World War II. One witness, Lieutenant James Donovan, an anti-aircraft gunner, later recalled, "I remember looking up at the sky that morning, watching fireballs fall one by one. I thought, if victory ever had a sound, it was the sound of the fuse exploding." As the sun set on the 1st of January 1945, the clouds thinned and the ground glowed red under the winter twilight. In the sky, black trails of smoke still lingered. From below, American soldiers looked up and saw the sunlight glinting off the wreckage of burning planes. Someone whispered, and in that silence the Luftwaffe died. There were no more engines, no more bombing raids. The Bodenplatte offensive was over, and with it, the last hope of Nazi Germany in the skies of Europe vanished into smoke. In the spring of 1945, when the last guns fell silent, numbers began to replace the sounds of war. In the summary reports from the US Department of Defense, one statistic stood above all. 22 million proximity fuses had been produced during the war, with an operational efficiency exceeding 80%, according to the US Teens. War Production Board Final Report, 1946. This was the only project in the entire American industrial war effort that achieved reliability beyond its planned threshold. No military product had ever reached such a low error rate before. From the assembly lines of Crosley, Sylvania, and RCA to the testing rooms of Johns Hopkins APL, every component was documented, tested, and standardized with unprecedented precision. The Fuse Program's inspection system became a model for the post-war industry. The Americans called it the Quality Control Revolution. In the Industrial Engineering Review, 1947, the methods of batch coding, random sampling, and statistical error recording were described as a quantitative leap that carried manufacturing into the era of scientific management. Engineers later applied those principles to automobile production, electronics, and even medicine. From a weapon, the proximity fuse gave birth to a new philosophy how to manage knowledge and quality in an industrial economy. But its legacy did not end there. The miniaturized radar technology inside the fuse became the foundation for the entire modern weapons industry. According to the U.S. Army Ordnance Development Review, 1948, engineers built upon the radio wave reflection principle of the VT to develop the first generation of guided missiles, from paveway smart bombs to satellite-based sensors. That principle, written in a 1945 report by Dr. Merle Tuve, was simple. A device must be able to measure its environment to decide its action. The statement, seemingly technical, in fact paved the way for the modern concept that the world would later call the smart weapon. The scientists who had worked on the project were later reassigned across the nation. James Van Allen, who designed the pencil-sized vacuum tube for the fuse, joined the University of Iowa's rocket research program. In 1958, he became the first to discover the Van Allen radiation belts, the energetic zones surrounding Earth. When asked about his beginnings, he replied, "I learned to listen to the radio echo from shells before I listened to the universe." A simple sentence, yet it reflected the thread connecting warfare to space science. As for Dr. Merle Tuve, after leaving APL, he was appointed director of the National Research Laboratory. He declined all personal awards, always saying the work belonged to the collective of tens of thousands who labored in silence. In his final photographs, he still wore thick glasses, seated beside a model of a fuse encased in glass. On its label were the words, "The device that made the sky measurable." From a weapon of war, it had become a symbol of applied science, where knowledge transcends the boundaries of conflict. According to the U.S. Department of Defense Post-War Technology Survey, 1949, more than 100 industrial companies transferred experience from the fuse program into civilian production, laying the groundwork for the consumer electronics boom of the 1950 seconds. Factories that once soldered vacuum tubes for artillery shells began producing radios, televisions, and signal instruments. The precision of the fuse became the standard across engineering disciplines. Even the term fail-safe, safe even in failure, originated from the design principles of this project. At the military level, the proximity fuse completely transformed the concept of warfare. When radar and computation converged, the battlefield was no longer governed by a soldier's intuition or an officer's sightline. Victory was measured by the speed at which knowledge could be turned into action. The British War College lecture notes, 1952, concluded, "The Battle of the Bulge was the first proof of data warfare. He who processes information faster survives." From that point, the concept of data-driven warfare emerged, forming the basis of NATO strategy throughout the Cold War. In later years, people began to reflect on the moral weight of this invention. Many former engineers admitted to living with conflicted feelings, both pride and unease. During a 1965 symposium in Washington, a woman who had worked as a factory assembler at Sylvania stood up and said, "I don't know how many people I killed with those welds, but I know thousands of soldiers came home because of them." The hall fell silent. It showed that war could never be separated from conscience, even when veiled under the skin of technology. In May 1980, the Smithsonian Institution opened an exhibition titled "The Fuse That Changed the War." In a softly lit room, a real fuse stood at the center, beside a photograph of the women workers in the Silver Spring workshop. Visitors paused to read a small plaque that said, "Produced under secrecy, used under desperation, remembered under silence." A veteran of the 101st Airborne stood for a long time, then whispered, "When that thing worked, we lived." In the history of technology, few inventions have embodied both destruction and the advancement of human knowledge so profoundly. From wartime radar experiments to spacecraft sensors, from shell assembly lines to electronics factories, every step forward carried the imprint of the proximity fuse. It stood at the intersection of mathematics, physics, and survival, and ultimately, its lesson was not about power, but about perception. The Battle of the Bulge proved that 20th century warfare no longer belonged to numbers, but to the ability to transform data into decisions at the fastest pace. In the cold fog of the Ardennes, an invention had turned the sky into an instrument of calculation. From that moment, the world understood that technology does more than shape how we fight it, defines how we exist.